Question: how did the brothels of ancient Rome compare to the United States in 2026? Spoiler alert, they were very similar. A lot more similar than you would even think. Today on Nutty History, we're going in to reveal the filthy secrets of Rome that no history class would ever tell you. And we'll find out if we may be living in a Roman brothel ourselves. I'd like to introduce you to somebody. This is Lucille. Now, Lucille is only 19. Like many Americans, Lucille is heavily in debt. I mean, come on, the struggle was real. She works a minimum wage job that barely brings in enough money to pay rent, buy food, and afford insurance. Lucille doesn't have any kind of emergency savings if she gets sick. Her rights are extremely limited, because she's a woman. And society around her treats her like she is less than a man. She makes less money in an hour than what we pay for a Happy Meal. Even in ancient Rome, where Lucille is from, that money wasn't enough for 2 loaves of bread. Her life was dangerous, demeaning, and is evidence of the double standards of Roman society. The ancient Roman Empire is often remembered for its many deplorable, unstable, and corrupt rulers, whose behavior exposed the darker reality behind what the West often celebrated at the height of patriarchal civilization. It's a land where 40% of men and women were slaves. In ancient Rome, slavery wasn't about the color of your skin. It was about where you were born and who you were born from. If you were not Roman, there was an 8 out of 10 chance you were a slave. Being a slave as a man was already horrible, but being a woman slave? Ooh, you could say it was probably the worst fate imaginable. Like ancient Greece, ancient Rome was not known for its fair treatment of females. I mean, let's be honest here. History has been very upfront about how women were treated like second-class citizens in Roman society. And every balding senator of Rome with land and gold in his pocket, well, they would use every excuse possible to control these women's lives. They were citizens, but they were not allowed to vote or hold office. The only job expected of women of even the most privileged families was to be loyal and efficient housewives that could bear and raise kids, while the men could enjoy their lives with younger concubines. A side piece. As a woman, your education, your status in society, and your freedom all depended on your father or your husband. What mattered was your purity. Women were supposed to be the symbol and bearer of sanctity of Roman society. Now, none of those rules applied to the men. And yet it's no secret that the conservative, code-ridden, and chauvinistic corners of Rome were crowded with brothels that were the major contributor to the empire's economy. Why? Well, the answer is a lot simpler and more relevant than you could ever imagine. Money, greed, wealth concentration, pleasure. There's a reason your current internet feed is filled with shorts of men like Elon Musk, Peter Thiel, and Mark Zuckerberg talking about ancient Rome. They love it, they aspire to it, and they want the system back. And the way ancient brothels were run shows precisely why. When we talk about these brothels and street workers of ancient Rome, we're not talking about the darkest alleys of the Roman Empire. We're not looking for the shunned districts where no decent man or woman would step in the dark of night. There were no red light districts. There were no restricted zones, no kind of neighborhoods where one might warn their kids to not wander off to. You see, the brothels of ancient Rome operated more like vendors selling fast food at any corner of New York City, instead of operating like a franchise brick-and-mortar Starbucks. Because to sell fornication, you need a bed, not a dedicated building. Just like anyone with a coffee maker can sell Americano without having an overpriced franchise signboard at their doorstep. You can imagine the working conditions were not much better than Starbucks. Most of the brothels worked as a sublet of an inn or tavern. The Calpurnia is what the quarters for brothels were known as in Rome. For real, it was in fact the best option to find a lodging house or a tavern, an inn or a restaurant if you're looking to sow your wild oats. The ladies of the night would often travel with men in charge of their business who would lodge and sit around these public places of eating, drinking, and lodging, happy to take men with coins to their merchandise. Dedicated brothels were numbered and labeled, and probably the most well-known Roman brothel is the Lupanare, the den of she-wolves in Pompeii. But it was pretty common in Rome that the lovely couple that lived in the house next to you was running a brothel at their place too. with a wife, sister, and daughter involved, and usually there was more than one of them being offered as a service woman. The family needed money to pay the always increasing rent, to make up for the husband's small income in the time of inflation and poverty. Now, there are not a lot of records of any Roman cities having a dedicated suburra, known as the Latin term for a brothel district, like for example the red light district in Amsterdam. Interestingly, the cities that had a suburra were located in the poshest, luxurious neighborhoods. Their clientele was metropolitan and diverse, men from both rich and poor families, privileged and suppressed sections of societies. Romans and foreigners alike would visit brothels in cities like Pompeii to have a taste of women captured, enslaved, and forced into the business of pleasing. Oral experience with a brothel worker would cost a person 2 asarion, roughly equal to $5.50 in 2026. Now, the full meal deal service was available at the low price of a asarion. In 2026, that's less than $22. Subscribing to a certain site about digital fans cost you more for virtual gratification these days. Certain brothels that were more organized in their ways would also provide their clients coins with numbers on one side and a performance position molded on the other. Now, a prominent theory is that these tokens were offered in return for prepaid money, so the clients would go to their chosen woman and simply give them the coin to explain what service they were looking for. It could also be used as a summoning message sent by her wealthy client to be available at a certain time and day. I mean, the entire system was cheap, easy, and morally non-objectionable because Romans didn't consider paying for pleasure an act of infidelity. But it was perfectly justified under Roman law for a husband to take the life of a male brothel worker if he caught him red-handed offering services to his wife. And yes, there were many male brothel workers in Rome who were apparently more problematic for their society than women brothel workers. But we'll get to that a little bit later, because by now we know that, like us, you would also be wondering, what's with the double standard? Why was having women hustlers a flourishing industry in a conservative society like the ancient Roman Republic? Well, money, greed, and wealth concentration. Brothels and streetwalkers, some use the phrase today, she's for the streets, coinciding with these streetwalkers, not only existed in ancient Rome brothels, but they openly flaunted their goods and services on the streets of Roman cities. The people who created and ran this patriarchal society also profited heavily from the brothel industry, so they didn't mind this. It didn't matter if a woman was a free citizen or a slave, the money she made as a brothel worker would never go to her directly anyway. It would go to the men managing her. This manager would then offer her a very small share for doing most of the work, his share for bringing her clients and passing on the biggest piece to the owner of the brothel, or in most cases, the rich men who owned the women. Kind of like what a pimp would do. By the 1st century AD, they even found a way to leech money off women who would dare go independent and run their business solo, like they do now with OnlyFans or other cam work. As the privileged class couldn't claim this money themselves, they started taxing women who were registered as streetwalkers in Roman cities. They were bureaucratic about keeping record of brothels and brothel workers long before the taxation happened. And guess what? Those taxes were used as an excuse to lift the burden of taxation from the wealthy class. What does that remind you of? High-class courtesans, which were known as the delicatae and meretrix, were 1% of the Roman brothel industry and could certainly afford those taxes. Here's the deal. Delicatae were not even in the game for the money. These women were usually rebellious daughters of wealthy, privileged families who wanted to bring shame and dishonor to their arrogant and powerful fathers. They would wear masks to hide their identity, but their clientele, they definitely knew who they were. But taxation like this took a toll on lower-class free citizens, who could be found in local, dingy and unventilated, steamy bathhouses and shabby taverns. The women who would escape registration were called prostibulae and ambulatae, unclean provincial streetwalkers, waiting outside or near high-priced brothels, gladiatorial arena venues, theaters, and circuses ready and willing for just 2 coins. But if one was really wanting to get down and dirty and couldn't even afford those low prices, or if one was truly a creep, then the place to seek action was the graveyard. There, if the seeking party was lucky, they might find a bustuarii. These malnourished women were scraping the filthy bottoms of the barrels that you may call Roman economy. They were usually sickly-looking women with hardly any skin on the bone, sunken eyes, and a pale face. Maybe comparable to what a modern-day homeless woman would look like, but worse. You may have got an idea of why such women chose graveyards as their base of operations. Well, if we're being honest, they had no other option. The bustuaria used chalk on the backs of headstones to advertise their prices. You know, like today's special, a Beyonce hand puppet and some cream cheese. I mean, they would engage in intimate acts within tomb passages and secluded plots. It was the worst possible income source in the business, but given the kind of clients they had to serve, all they had to do was lie still on a cold stone. Ooh. And yet the Romans considered men who would sell themselves as hustlers even worse than bustuariae. There was a very small market for men offering their services to women because of social reservations on how limited women's rights were in Rome. But of course, the 1% privileged families were above the law, and women would take on male lovers and courtesans outside their marriages if they could just keep it hush-hush for the sake of their husband's social status and masculinity. You have to protect the masculinity. Now, believe it or not, women weren't the only clients that sought male hustlers. Same-gender relationships were stigmatized in ancient Rome in a very different way than today. It was completely fine to be in such a relationship as long as you weren't on the receiving end, because that would be a serious dent on your masculinity. And like I said, you gotta protect the masculinity. So being in the business of bodily fluids exchange with other men was heavily stigmatized. Just make sure nobody finds out or catches you in the act. It was generally expected of such a man to be a professional receiver, which would hurt their social image, and it was bad for clients too if it came out that they paid to receive. Now, all that doesn't matter if you were the emperor like Nero or Hadrian, because you could keep multiple male concubines and nobody would bat an eye. So the question is, are we currently living in a Roman brothel society? Well, let us know in the comments. Now, if you enjoyed